the Night Court ASMR. Hello, darling, and welcome to the Night Court. As always, it's your choice, and you've chosen an end-of-day meditation appropriate for dusk. Now, I do just want to say that I know there is a glare that I can't seem to get rid of, or at least don't have the wherewithal today to do. So, on my glasses, but my eyes have been really dry and agitated, and I normally wear contacts. Just normal contacts, not cool ones that do anything to my eyes, but except that they let me see. I am wearing these just because they're comfortable today, but I still also really wanted to make a video and record for you. So we're gonna do, a bit of a librarian vibe here. I've got my books, as I so often do. But yes, I do apologize for the glare you might be getting here. But hopefully, as I always think ASMR, sound is more important. Hopefully it's not too much of a problem for you. So yeah, and before anyone comments, I do know there are ways to deal with this. I don't have, I know I could add a couple of lights at 45-degree angles and so on, and I know I could do a bounce, but one of my lights is actually not working. This is very relaxing. We're doing rambles and books today, but one of my lights is making like this whining sound that comes through in the videos. So we're going with what we've got today. Thank you. And I hope, as I said, the sound is enough to interest you. So we're going to do an end-of-day meditation appropriate for dusk. We'll be in the court of dusk. We're going to talk about my beloved Stoics and perhaps some others. I'll share with you some different things I've been reading lately and have read in the past that I think are relevant. So I am just a bit under the weather. As such, I've also got some tea here, as my throat is a little bit dry. I have this really nice glass mug, actually, with the tea diffuser as a part of it. And the lid that allows you to have a place to store your diffuser when you're done using it. Very loose leaf tea. You probably by now, if you've watched any other videos, know I have a love of tea. I also have a love of coffee, but maybe that's just a totally different video. Because there's so much to say about coffee. But let's take my tea out of this. And we'll get to the video soon. It's all the video though, right? It's all relaxing. And if you are here to hear about philosophy, just skip ahead. I'll leave timestamps, which I try to do when I think it makes sense for a video. So yeah, we've just got our kind of low lighting today, and our tea, and our books. Tea and books, I mean, what else could someone want? It's very hookah, which is actually, maybe I should do a video about that too, because I read a book about it. It's a Swedish philosophy. I'm pretty sure it's Swedish. They sell books about it at IKEA, literally. But there are a lot of cool Scandinavian philosophies about how to enjoy life. But I always think that my tea and my books, my cozy corner, fall under the hookah. So I'm going to place my tea over here. And I invite you into my little library of philosophy books, of which there are many more, but let's get into a few. And I think too, even if I'm not reading something directly from one of the Stoics, there's a lot of overlap in some of the other stuff I read. There's interconnection. So I have this book, How to Die, which is a compilation of various philosophies of Seneca's. I'll read you some of the intro, and then we can read some of the direct quotations of his. We'll see how many of the others we get to. We could do this endlessly. But we'll start directly with some Stoic context, and then maybe branch out to some other books that I find profoundly helpful, especially in times of trouble. Should you be going through a time like that, I don't think any of this can hurt, certainly. And I'll read a few other thinkers. Now, I should mention of Seneca. He wrote a lot about how to live and to die. And I will just put a disclaimer out there now, though we're not going to be talking about it a lot or anything like that. Seneca did kill himself. He was ordered to, from what I understand, and I'm no historian, by the Emperor Nero. Nero was not one of the good Roman emperors, which I think most of us, even if we've seen a little bit of historical fiction or cinema, or maybe been to Rome, learned anything really about Rome, kind of know that Nero was not one of the emperors who has remained beloved through the years. He did a lot of problematic things, including not being a fan of Seneca's. Anyway, there's more to all that, but I just wanted to mention it because I don't want it to seem as though I am personally endorsing suicide. So that is not what I intend to do, but I did just want to put that caveat out there. Having said all that, I still think, despite the manner of anyone's death, really, I mean, almost, you can not say anything 100% of the time is true, but almost anyone probably had something to contribute. And Seneca quite a lot, whether or not you disagree with the manner of his death. And of course it was under duress. It's complicated, but I'll read a bit about him here. There's a great opening quote. He lives badly who does not know how to die well. On serenity of mind. That's directly pulled from some of Seneca's writings. I'll read some of the introduction. In the largest frame, everything is fine. That sounds very much like the message Seneca preached to Roman readers of the mid-1st century AD, relying on Stoic philosophy as a way to glimpse that truth. The interconnectedness of all things is the truth the writer speaks of. It was also one of his principal themes, as was the idea that one must rehearse for death throughout one's life. Stoics do talk a lot about death, don't they? For life, properly understood, is really only a journey toward death. We are dying every day from the day we are born. In the passages collected here, excerpted from 8 different works of ethical thought, Seneca spoke to his addressees and taught them to humankind generally, and through them to humankind generally, about the need to accept death, even to the point of ending one's own life, as I mentioned before, with a candor nearly unparalleled in his time or ours. And I do think, as you know, I can't help but put in my commentary. Oh boy, one of the most difficult ways to go through life is regularly walking through with the fear of death. It can make you act out all sorts of strange things and ways and not enjoy the time you have here. I've certainly seen it in people that I've known. Study death always, Seneca counseled his friend Lucilius, and he took his own advice. From what is likely his earliest work, the Consolation to Marcia, written around AD 40, to the magnum opus of his last years, 63 to 65, called the Moral Epistles. Seneca returned again and again to this theme. It crops up in the midst of unrelated discussions as though never far from his mind. A ringing endorsement of rational suicide. For example, intrudes without warning into advice about keeping one's temper. In On Anger, another writing of his. Examined together as they are in this volume, Seneca's thoughts organize themselves around a few key themes: the universality of death, its importance as life's final and most defining rite of passage, its part in purely natural cycles and processes, and its ability to liberate us by freeing souls from bodies or, in the case of suicide, to give us an escape from pain, from the degradation of enslavement, or from the cruel kings and tyrants who might otherwise destroy our moral integrity. This last point, as I mentioned before, had particular resonance for Seneca and his original readers, who had often seen death or degradation arrive at an emperor's behest. We talked about Nero, a politician as well as a philosopher. Seneca had been a young senator in the late 30s AD when Caligula went mad. And if you don't know who Caligula is, there are some very dirty movies about him. He was mentally ill, but quite evil. And Caligula was one of those, when you read about the fall of Rome and sort of the decay of the whole thing, Caligula was, of course, a big part of that. When Caligula went mad and began brutalizing those he mistrusted, in the 40s under Claudius, Seneca was himself sentenced to death in a political show trial, but the sentence was commuted to exile on the island of Corsica. Recalled to Rome and appointed tutor to young Nero, so he was his tutor. Seneca spent the 50s and early 60s inside the imperial household, watching as Nero became more deranged and toward family members whom he perceived as threats, murderous. Finally suspected, probably wrongly, of collusion in a failed assassination plot. Seneca too incurred Nero's wrath and was forced to commit suicide himself in his 60s in AD 65. So, I will get ahead to a bit more of Seneca's actual writing. Seneca continued to publish throughout the 15 years he spent at Nero's side. So I'll read from a passage here. In his essay on serenity of mind, Seneca makes the case that fear of death not only makes dying more difficult, but diminishes the nobility and immoral integrity of all life. In the second passage below, he uses Julius Canis, a man otherwise barely known to us, to illustrate the greatness of mind, which is found in those unafraid of death. Here we go. What's to be feared in returning to where you came from? He lives badly who does not know how to die well. Thus, we must first and foremost reduce the price we set on life and count our breath among the things we think cheap. As Cicero says, gladiators who seek by every means to preserve their life we detest, but we favor those who wear their disregard of it like a badge. Know that the same outcome awaits us all, but dying fearfully often is itself a cause of death. Dame Fortune, who makes us her sport, says, "Why should I keep you alive, you lowly, cowering creature? You'll be more wounded and slashed if you don't learn how to offer your throat willingly. But you'll live longer and die more easily if you accept the sword stroke bravely without pulling back your neck or holding up your hands. He who fears death will never do anything to help the living, but he who knows that this was decreed the moment he was conceived will live by principle, and at the same time will ensure, using the same power of mind, that nothing of what happens to him comes as a surprise." In later life, to judge by the moral epistles, another writing of his that I mentioned before, Seneca witnessed the illnesses and deaths of many close contemporaries and made careful note of how each man faced his final challenge. He then held up these exemplars for the edification of his friend Lucilius and through the publication of the letters, the entire Roman world. So this is the letter. I went to see how Phidias passes, a very noble fellow, stricken and struggling with the advancing of years. But already there is more to weigh him down than lift him up, for old age is leaning upon him with its huge weight everywhere. The man's body, as you know, was ever weak and desiccated. He held or even patched it together, as I might more accurately say, for a long time. But suddenly it gave out, just as when a ship has got water in the hold, be stopped up, but once it has begun to come apart in many spots and to go under, there's no more help for the splitting vessel, just so in an old man's body. Weakness can be supported and propped up for a time, but when, just as in a rotting house, every joint is coming apart and a new crack opens up while you're patching the old, then it's time to look around for a way to leave. Really kind of poetic too, the way that he writes, isn't it? But our friend passes, stayed sharp-minded. You know, the Stoics often talk about how I would say the life of the mind, and how that's more important, arguably. Not to say one shouldn't be concerned for one's physical health, but how that's where one really lives and can ascend, despite being in horrible circumstances, right? Seneca, he had some illnesses and things as well, but so many of the other Stoics, like Epictetus comes to mind, right? Because he was a slave and not well physically for most of his life, I believe. And that, those examples, it's not easy to rise above it, but especially when you have no choice in death and old age, why not comport yourself with not only dignity, and he's going to get into this in this example, but in a way that uses what you still have available to you, right? You're only who's a slave is only a slave if he allows himself to be in his mind, you know. And one can be a slave, I think, to the fear of death. We just make so many choices based on that, you know, like you see it in modern society, of course. I think even the incredible greed that we see sometimes, it's really just a fear of death coming to bear, isn't it? Like this idea that if we get enough, if we garner enough, if life is comfortable enough, then we can somehow put off death. And it's the most foolish thing, because no one really believes anything other than that we must die, right? To think elsewise is folly. And but I think that's what it all really is. It's just like this spider-like grappling for more, some way of pushing off death, really, somehow. So he says, their friend, who stays sharp-minded, philosophy furnishes him with this: to be cheerful when death comes in view, to stay strong and happy no matter what one's bodily condition, and not to let go even when one is let go of. Therefore, Bassus declares, death is as far beyond all other evils as it is beyond the fear of evils. I know such things are often said and often must be said, but they have never done me so much good, either when reading them or hearing people say that we must not fear things that don't hold any terrors. It's the man who speaks from death's own neighborhood that has the most authority in my eyes. I'll say plainly what I believe. I think that the man in the midst of death is braver than the one who skirts its edges. The approach of death lends even to the ignorant the resolve to face inevitabilities. Like a gladiator who, though very skittish throughout his combat, offers his neck to his enemy and guides the sword toward himself if it strays off target. But the death that is only nearby, though sure to arrive, does not grant that steady firmness of resolve, a rarer thing be exhibited by a sage. I would gladly listen, therefore, to one who can, as it were, report on death, giving his opinion about it and showing what it's like, as though having seen it close up. See, I know it can seem bleak, but I feel quite uplifted. By reminding myself that one day I will die. How else? I mean, what else really could lend so much meaning to life as it is? I really like the sound of this, of these pages. And so I think, in connection with some of these concepts, I'll also read you. I don't think I've read anything from On the Shortness of Life yet by Seneca. But there's a passage that I'm sure some of you have heard before, and if you haven't, welcome, because it's so illuminating and hopeful, and a reminder that at any point, I think, we can start valuing the time that we have, but it is difficult to do so without recognizing that it will end one day. I think we make better decisions if we willingly accept that. So, he said, "It is not that we have a short space of time, but that we waste much of it. Life is long enough, and it has been given in sufficiently generous measure to allow the accomplishment of the very greatest things, if the whole of it is well invested. But when it is squandered in heedless luxury and carelessness, when it is devoted to no good end, forced at last by the ultimate necessity we perceive," some people also say, they quote it as, "by death's final constraint, we perceive that it has passed away before we were aware that it was passing. So it is. The life we receive is not short, but we make it so, nor do we have any lack of it, but are wasteful of it. Just as great and princely wealth is scattered in a moment when it comes into the hands of a bad owner, while wealth, however limited, if it is entrusted to a good guardian, increases by use, so our life is amply long for him who orders it properly. Life is plenty long enough if you know how to use it." I've read several translations of that quote, so sometimes when I read it, I sort of hear all the different translations that have been rendered, but all give the same notion to us, don't they? Life is plenty long enough if you know how to use it. And I think Seneca would agree that knowing death is coming is a part of being able to use it well. There's another, these are contemporary authors now that I've been reading. I've been reading Oliver Burkman. He wrote another book. Oh, there's so much to get into. So many more videos we could talk about this stuff in. But he wrote another book called 4,000 Weeks, which I cannot recommend enough. But without getting too detailed, the title, and this is very much the point, 4,000 Weeks is in fact sort of the napkin math of how long most of us will live, based on just sort of, average lifespan. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very long to me. So often, like a week will pass, and I'll just be surprised to reach the end of it. Like, I'm sure that's a phenomenon we've all experienced. And of course, none of this is very very sagacious or novel, but I think it bears reminding oneself 4 weeks in a month. How often do we all say, oh my gosh, it's next month already? Like, that's nothing, 4,000 weeks, but plenty long enough if you know how to use it. Whew. Oliver Burkman is great. He wrote for The Guardian, I think, and he's done a bunch of different writing, but he at one point was sort of like a productivity guru. And he talks a lot about his own sort of anecdotal experience as well in trying to increase his own efficiency, as if in doing so one could increase one's overall ability to enjoy life. And again, all of that is like with this fear of death in mind, like I have to get everything done instead of just enjoying life and using it well. And he makes a wonderful case in 4,000 Weeks for how to do that, which things to take on board and which things not to. But I love that he's come from this background of sort of being obsessively productive and trying all these different efficiency systems and writing about them, because I myself, not to get too personal, but I have a real tendency to do the same, and have really appreciated his writing for that reason. I had this teacher once, a mentor of mine who passed away, and sorry, it makes me a little emotional. And I remember him saying that one day, like he thought to himself, if I and this was a man who was not obsessed with productivity. He's an acting teacher, lovely person, and he was like, I sometimes think that if I ever cross the final thing off my to-do list, then I'll just die. Like that'll be when it happens. And he was joking, but there's something to that. And I sometimes think to myself, like, I will arrive at happiness when I've got all the things done and behind me. And then before I know it, it's tax time again or whatever. And it's like, I just did this. I said that I was going to be happy and feel comfortable and at peace when I got this task done, right? Like I was going to check all these boxes and I was going to feel great. And like, lo and behold, that didn't happen, right? You get like a moment of respite from your worry before something shows up on the list again. And so I've been working on this type of thinking with myself, and Oliver Burkman's been really helpful. I am by no means having all the success that I would like, all the time in the way that I think, but I'm trying to bring some more peace to my mind and get more comfortable with the idea of not finishing the to-do list. And I always have this echo of that teacher, my friend, who said, that'll just be it. And I'd rather die with something still on my to-do list, as he did. And he died well. Left a lot of really wonderful people. People wonderfully touched by his presence in his wake. So, I think if we talk regularly about death, it becomes less scary. And so, 4,000 Weeks was a wonderful book that I read, and now I'm reading Meditations for Mortals by Oliver Burkman. The intention is to read it over the course of a month, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. He's never saying that we shouldn't have ambition or strive, or, of course, attempt to be efficient. But he does sort of recognize, and having tried so long himself, and of course he's done a ton of research, right? This is not just like his anecdotal, it's not all anecdata. But, just really striving to give yourself the grace to not finish everything and to allow positive distractions into your life. So I'm going to read. Let's see, which day should I read? So each chapter is a day for you to read. You're supposed to read it over time so you can really digest what's been told to you. I'll read one of the shorter ones. He's also quite funny in the way that he writes. But yeah, let's all collectively try not to put off being happy until we have a certain thing done. You can just, apparently I've been told, you can just be happy. You just decide that. Isn't that empowering? Okay. Day 3. This chapter is called You Need Only Face the Consequences on Paying the Price. He has a quote at the top. You are free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences. And we'll get into what that means. So Oliver Burkman says, a friend of mine was trying to decide whether to leave his marriage. Though neither partner's fault, it was clearly headed nowhere good. But he felt paralyzed by 2 equally appalling options. To walk away would mean causing anguish to his wife and scandalizing his traditionalist family. But to grit his teeth and stay would be to condemn both of them to decades of misery or force his wife to do the leaving. As it's all too easy to do in such dilemmas, he subconsciously concluded that if a given option wouldn't be painless, and it was clear that neither option would be, it must therefore be impossible. So he froze in place, hoping some third option might magically make itself known. It took a while before it dawned on him that there was a different way to approach the situation. Not a third option, but a new perspective on the existing ones. He saw that he could acknowledge that leaving would be terrible, yet that if it mattered to him enough, he was free to do it anyway, and to deal as responsibly as he could with the resulting awfulness as the price he was willing to pay, facing the truth that the choice would come with costs, and that he would elect to shoulder them gave him the psychological room for maneuver that he'd been missing. He left. It was awful, but life moved on. At some point, as you seek to spend more of your finite existence in the ways that feel most meaningful to you, the thought will inevitably occur to you that you can't make a certain choice about your time, however much you'd like to, because the circumstances simply don't allow it. The obstacle could be as weighty as the belief that you can't walk away from a marriage or a dispiriting career because of the emotional or financial impact on yourself or on others. Right? These are very real dilemmas. Or it might be as mundane as the notion that you can't spend half an hour on an exhilarating creative project today because there are too many emails to be answered or too many household chores that need completing first. These are valid concerns. But the idea that they eliminate all room for choice isn't entirely correct. The truth, though it often makes people indignant to hear it, is that it's almost never literally the case that you have to meet a work deadline, honor a commitment, answer an email, fulfill a family obligation, or anything else. The astounding reality, in the words of Sheldon B. Cobb, a genial and brilliant American psychotherapist who died in 1999, is that you're pretty much free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences. There's the catch. Consequences aren't optional. It's in the nature of being finite that every choice comes with some sort of consequences, because at any instant you can only pick one path and must deal with the repercussions of not picking any of the others. Spending a week's holiday in Rome means that spending that same week in Paris Avoiding a conflict in the short term, means not spending that same week in Paris. Avoiding a conflict in the short term means dealing with whatever might result from letting a bad situation fester. Freedom isn't a matter of somehow wriggling free of the costs of your choices. Remember that. That's never an option. But of realizing that nothing stops you doing anything at all as long as you're willing to pay those costs. Unless you're literally being physically coerced into doing something, the notion that you have to do it in truth means that you've chosen not to pay the price of refusing. Just as the notion that you absolutely can't do something generally means you're unwilling to pay the price of doing it. You could quit your job with no backup plan. You could book a one-way ticket to Rio de Janeiro or rob a bank, or tell your social media followers your honest views. The conservative American economist Thomas Sowell summed things up with a bleakness I appreciate, insisting that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. The only two questions at any moment of choice in life is what the price is and whether or not it's worth paying. This can come as a revelation and a liberation to the anxious among us, partly because it cuts genuinely agonizing choices down to a more manageable number, but also because it reminds us that most of the potential consequences we find ourselves agonizing about don't remotely justify such angst. By the way, Oliver Burkman is British, and I've heard him read some things, some different meditations. He's very funny with his delivery too. So, if ignoring an email causes its sender a flick of irritation, or if your in-laws frown at your approach to parenting, the correct response might very well be, so what? Laura Vanderkam, who has interviewed many working mothers for books on how to manage work and family life, frequently hears versions of the same refrain. I can't relax in the evening until the children's toys are tidied away. But the reality, of course, there is no 11 p.m. home inspection with someone coming round to see if all the toys are picked up, notes Vanderkam. You need only be willing to pay the price of relaxing in such circumstances, which is a less than pristine home. There's an elephant in the room here that can't be tidied away, of course, which is that the consequence of any given choice might be vastly more severe for some people than for others. There are those who'd get fired if they ignored a few emails, or violently abused for a toy-strewn house. But these grossly unfair realities don't change the fact that each choice is always and only a matter of weighing the trade-offs. If a path you'd love to take is genuinely likely to leave you destitute or seriously harmed in some other way, then you probably shouldn't take it. But for most of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, the temptation is often to exaggerate potential consequences so as to spare ourselves the burden of making a bold choice. It's a particular peril among the progressive-minded, I've noticed, to take the fact that a given choice might be unfeasible for the underprivileged as a reason not to make it yourself. But unless it's you who's underprivileged, that's an alibi, not an argument. It was a central insight of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre that there's a secret comfort in telling yourself you've got no options, because it's easier to wallow in the bad faith of believing yourself trapped than to face the dizzying responsibilities of your freedom. But the liberation can be dizzying too. When you begin approaching life as a matter of facing consequences, you'll frequently find yourself declining to spend time on things you never much cared for in the first place, but might previously not have dared to turn down. Some people are naturals at this. Oh dear, the English comedian Peter Cook is said to have responded when David Frost, the journalist and chat show host, phoned to invite him to dinner with Prince Andrew and his wife, Sarah Ferguson. Checking my diary, I find him watching television that night. At other times, though, you'll go ahead and do the undesired thing anyway, because you understand the cost and you don't want to incur it. Notice how different that is, how different it is, how different it feels from grudgingly saying yes because you feel you have no choice. than resenting it for days. For example, and I think this is so important because some of these mundanities in life, this is me speaking now, are the ones that cause us the most daily grief, For example, perhaps you care enough about the friend who's asking you to cancel your plans and help her move house this weekend that it's worth saying yes. The stress and disappointment you'd cause her by refusing is a price you're unwilling to pay. Whatever choice you make, so long as you make it in the spirit of facing the consequences, the result will be freedom. And the only sense that finite humans ever get. To enjoy it. Not freedom from limitation, which is something we unfortunately never get to experience, but freedom in limitation. Freedom to examine the trade-offs, because there will always be trade-offs, and then to opt for whichever trade-off you like. I appreciate how grounded that is. He often refers to humans as finite, right? And this is just kind of part of his work. But you get used to that phrase, and I think that's also a very Stoic idea. Just recognizing our finitude and embracing that, and then making more joyful decisions. Because really, you can't not make a decision, right? Not making a decision is also making a decision. So we have to recognize that that is inevitably part of life. There are a couple of other quotes I really like. This is a quote attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas. I've heard it both ways. Not everything that is more difficult is more meritorious. So remember that, maybe. That's a nice thought to end on, right? Not everything has to be hard. And just because it's hard doesn't necessarily make it worth doing. And of course, the opposite is true. But I think it's sometimes hard to recognize. Well, thank you all for sticking with me. I've got so many more books, not enough time. I think I'm going to do another book that I can get to today because there's just so much I love from it that I don't think I have time to get it into this video. It's a series of lectures from Anthony DeMello from something called Awareness. Maybe I'll do that the next time I do a reading quotes and books type of video. Thanks for chatting about death with me. And I do hope, as is my intention, that these things are comforting, maybe thought-provoking, or perhaps possible to just completely bliss out to the sound of a whisper and not listen to, if that's also your jam. Now, darlings. Let the dark embrace of the night enfold you. Thank you for sticking with me. Sleep well. And maybe you're already asleep, and I'm planting seeds for pleasant dreams as you sleep. Good night. Good night. Good night. The Night Court.